Hey guys, it's George from Avante Garde, and CRM Jewelers has invited me back today to talk about the iconic Rolex Datejust. So we're gonna go over the history of the watch from the first one all the way to the modern ones. I'm gonna give you my thoughts on some of my favorite Datejust, and yeah, it's gonna be a great video, guys. Let's do it. So one comparison I would like to make about the Datejust to kind of a famous car is the Porsche 911. So if you know Porsche 911s, you know that they've been around for a lot of years and they're very recognizable. If you see a Porsche 911, say from the 1990s, or you see a modern one from 2019 or 2020, they all look kind of the same. They look very similar. They've evolved very little. They've changed very little over the past, 60 odd years. The Datejust is very similar. They do these small little tweaks as the decades go by, but it's still a classic. The design is recognizable from anywhere you see it. If you had a nice restaurant and you see someone wearing it, you know it's the Datejust. Even to non-watch connoisseurs, and the same with the Porsche 911, if you don't know cars, you see that car or you see that Datejust on the wrist and you know, hey, that's a classic, that's an icon. And I think that's the best thing this watch has going for it, that you kind of have to have one in your collection, in my opinion, if you want to be a real watch collector, because it's so iconic and so many brands have tried to copy this kind of style and look, but Rolex is the one that originated it. Let's talk about the first Datejust ever made. It came out in 1945, and this watch pretty much came out to represent 40 years of Rolex watches. Now, the first Datejust to ever come out actually didn't have the word Datejust printed on the dial. It was reference 4467, and it was on a Jubilee band, and it was made out of 18 karat gold. So the first one ever made was precious metal, not stainless steel. It also featured a coin edge kind of design on the case, and it was basically an icon just from the beginning. I mean, that to me is what a classic watch looks like. So one of the most iconic watches from the Datejust line is actually the Turn-O-Graph, which came out in the early 1950s. Now we have a modern one here in front of me, which is 36mm on a Jubilee band, much like the original one from the 1945. Now the Turn-O-Graph, believe it or not, was the first watch that Rolex ever put a rotating bezel on. That's right, it wasn't the Submariner, it was the Datejust. And basically it's like a rotating bezel, just like you've seen on the Submariner. And it's also nicknamed the Thunderbird from a lot of watch collectors. So it has that kind of iconic name structure, similar to like the Hulk and the Batman and all those other models. Now the Turn-O-Graph really was kind of a niche watch. They didn't sell too many of them, but they did produce them for a while, until 2002. So they definitely had a following. A lot of collectors kind of like it because it meshes that sports watch look from the Submariner and with more of a dressy look from the Datejust. And yeah, it's just one of those watches that, it kind of turns heads in the sense that people who know Rolex see a Datejust and they recognize it, and then they see that kind of rotating bezel and they're kind of like, whoa, what is that? That looks a little different. So that's something cool about the model that kind of stands out. Let's look at this Rolex Datejust Turn-O-Graph. Now this model, this particular one, is a 36mm on a Jubilee bracelet. So it kind of harkens back to the original one from 1945 with the bracelet. It is in stainless steel. It has this kind of polished bezel. And yeah, it's kind of an interesting watch for the simple fact that a lot of collectors now are kind of leaning towards the 41mm size, while the kind of the purist enthusiasts are still like that 36. So this is interesting because it's kind of like a Submariner, like I said, Submariner and Datejust mashup, and it has that classic sizing. So I personally, if you ask me, I'm 36mm gang all the time. I love that size. For me, I think that's what the Datejust should be. Whereas the new one is a little big, a little bulky, where this size is more unisex. I think a lot of people can wear it comfortably and it'll look good. But it's up to debate, definitely. Some people prefer the bigger stuff, some people prefer the vintage stuff. To me, this watch, I just like that simple size because I would wear it as a dress watch, not necessarily a sporty watch. I would rather get a Submariner for that or a GMT. So for me, this size makes perfect sense. Towards the late 1950s, Rolex introduced kind of precious metal into the Datejust line, specifically in the two-tone variation. Now we have a modern two-tone Datejust right here, and this piece is on the bigger side, but two-tone started off as a 36mm, so it was a very classic size. And then, the Datejust is kind of like a build your own watch. That's the way I like to describe it. There's so many different variations. There's really a Datejust for everyone, which is kind of the reason why the Datejust is so iconic. It's kind of Rolex's most versatile watch. You can have Roman numerals, you can have a turned engine bezel, you can have a fluted bezel with white gold, you can have diamonds on the dial, you can have normal stick indices, you can have, Arab dial Datejust as well. So, to cater towards that market. So yeah, the Datejust is very versatile. It's a sports watch that's waterproof. You can wear it every day pretty much. But to me, it's more of a dress watch. That's the way I see it. I know people that do wear one every day. Personally, it's the watch I put on either in two-tone or precious metal to just, go out on a nice dinner or maybe wear it under a suit. That's the way I see it in 36 millimeter. But really, it's a very diverse watch that is, to me, the best entry point into the Rolex brand. Now, you have the Oyster Perpetual in that line, but to me, this is the watch to go for. Coming into the 1960s, the kind of quartz crisis started. Now, Rolex, being a powerhouse brand that it is, still was affected by this, believe it or not. But Rolex being Rolex, they took this opportunity and decided to innovate. So they made a quartz watch. That's right, contrary to popular belief, Rolex did have a watch that ticked. And that watch was the Oysterquartz, also known as a Datejust with a quartz to most collectors, that's how they say it. Now, this watch was actually pretty unique. It had a very advanced quartz movement at the time. It was definitely revolutionary. It was very expensive at the time to produce as well. And it kind of takes cues from that kind of Joe Genta design, like the AP Royal Oak and the Nautilus in the bracelet design. So it's definitely a funky looking Datejust. It definitely stands out from the other ones. And it has that kind of collectability because collectors look at it and they say, wow, it's a Rolex that ticks. It's not a sweeping hand that's smooth. So it's funny because to the non-connoisseur, they kind of look at it and they might think it's a fake watch. Whereas the enthusiasts will recognize that kind of Genta style bracelet design and say, that's an Oysterquartz. That's a kind of a different style Datejust. So that's kind of a cool thing about that watch. Collectors really, really like it. And yeah, it's definitely different from your standard Datejust. The Datejust II was introduced to kind of compete with the new trends in the watch market, which is kind of a bigger size, bigger case. Now, the way Rolex did it was actually very smart. They did this actually with the ceramic Submariner as well when they transitioned from aluminum to ceramic. They had the 41 millimeter case size, right? But they actually increased the indices. So they were fatter indices, which gave that watch a bigger look and bigger feel on the wrist. Now, that watch, due to not the best demand or high demand, was discontinued in 2016. I think the reason why it was discontinued was it wasn't too different from the normal Datejust. Granted, it was bigger and the indices were bigger, but it's not like, for example, the Yachtmaster 1 and Yachtmaster 2. They look pretty different, but they also, you can tell they come from the same lineage or same family as watches. Whereas Datejust 2 just kind of looked like a new Datejust and with just different variations, a little bigger, like I said. And to a non-connoisseur, they were kind of just like, oh, it's just a Datejust. So it didn't really have that new watch feeling in the lineup, at least. After cancellation of the Datejust II, it seems like the watch market trends are kind of going back in terms of size. Originally, when that watch was introduced, it was kind of trying to compete with like these bigger watch brands like Panerai, Hublot, but now the trends are kind of going back. So Rolex has cut back. They've introduced a 36 millimeter, a new one, a new Datejust with a new movement in 2018. So yeah, the trends, guys, it seems like they're going back to normal. 36 to 40 millimeter is the sweet spot, in my opinion, for the line. Now, the 41 is still available as the Datejust 1, it's no longer Datejust 2. And yeah, it's a good oversized watch, but to me personally, the Datejust is better on the smaller end, not really on the bigger end. So, but that depends on you. I mean, if you like that bigger size, they still have it available. But if you like that traditional classic size, I think that's the one personally I would go for. So let's talk about some of my personal favorite Datejust. Now, I actually own a vintage one, 36 millimeter, classic size. It's a Roman dial, two-tone, yellow gold, fluted bezel. It's beautiful. It's a watch that I've had for a long time. It was one of my first nice watches besides the Omega Seamaster. And yeah, it's a vintage watch, so it looks kind of small to some people that aren't really watch connoisseurs, but people who like watches respect it, know what it is. And another reference I really like, or references I should say I like, are the 1601 and 1603. The one with that blue dial with the kind of stick batons and the fluted bezel. Absolutely gorgeous. That on a leather strap like from Christian from Theo & Harris does. Something like that, you know, makes the watch look a little more modern, but also vintage. And what can I say, guys? It's a classic. It looks fantastic with a suit. And yeah, that's personally one of my favorite Datejusts as well. Today we talked about one of the most iconic watches in the world from the most iconic brand, and that is the Rolex Datejust. So we've covered the most iconic models such as the Turn-O-Graph, the Oysterquartz, the Datejust II. And yeah, guys, this line is just so diverse. There's so many to choose from. And other than that, you know, this video has been great. I want to thank CRM for inviting me over again. And let me know what you guys want to see on the channel. This has been George from Avante Garde, and see you guys next time.